This is Alex, and welcome to The Last Climb. Today we're looking at mountain climbers who ignored every warning the mountain gave them and paid for it with their lives. From a woman who pushed through an Everest blizzard alone, to an attorney who kept climbing despite rockfall warnings, never knowing the boulder was already on its way down. It was September 3rd, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes, distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. It was May 18, 2016, on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, along the South Col route at around 25,000 feet. Above that point was the death zone, where the human body can only function for a limited time. Climbers move through it, knowing that delays aren't just inconvenient, they can become dangerous very quickly. Alina Vorsk, 41, worked in luxury real estate in Naples. She was used to controlling schedules and getting results on her own terms. She had climbed Mount Rainier and Denali, but nothing at this altitude. She joined a commercial expedition expecting structure and support, but not necessarily the level of discipline required. From the way this starts, it feels like she approached Everest as something she could manage, not something that would push back. The route above Camp 4 was made up of steep ice slopes with fixed ropes. Temperatures stayed around -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds were expected to increase later in the day. At that elevation, oxygen levels dropped to about 30% of sea level, making every step harder. Most teams leave before dawn to avoid deteriorating weather later on. Her expedition leader set a 1 a.m. departure time. That's standard, but Alina refused. She didn't want to start that early and pushed for a daylight climb instead. She eventually left around 6 a.m., about 5 hours behind the main group. That delay doesn't just put you behind schedule, it puts you in a completely different version of the mountain. As she moved higher, she began encountering climbers already descending from the summit. That meant stopping frequently, stepping aside, and waiting for others to pass. At that altitude, every stop takes effort to recover from. Breathing becomes more labored, and it's harder to regain momentum. Those pauses may not seem like much, but up there, they add up faster than people expect. By late morning, winds on Mount Everest reached 35 miles per hour. Blowing snow reduced visibility to under 30 feet, and the route became difficult to follow. At 25,500 feet, she paused on a narrow traverse, but stiff hands and hardened ice left little margin for error. Attempting to clip into the next anchor, her crampon caught, she fell sideways, and while the rope stopped her from falling down the mountain, it swung her into the slope, causing multiple rib fractures and serious head trauma. She was left suspended, unable to stabilize herself. At that point, it's not just about technique anymore. It comes down to whether your body can respond, and hers was already under too much stress. She couldn't regain proper footing, her movements slowed, and her coordination dropped. The cold continued to affect her. Her body was losing heat, and her ability to react was fading. You can see how everything starts stacking here. Fatigue, cold, and now injury. None of it is immediate on its own, but together it becomes overwhelming. Other climbers were nearby, but they were also slowed by congestion and worsening conditions. It took time for anyone to reach her, and at that altitude, time is limited. She remained in that position for over an hour. During that time, her condition continued to decline. The exposure, combined with her injuries, made recovery unlikely. Without movement or proper shelter, her body couldn't keep up with the stress. Her guides eventually reached her and tried to stabilize the situation. But moving an injured climber at that altitude, in those conditions, is extremely slow. Winds continued to increase and visibility remained low. Even with help, there's only so much anyone can do up there. The mountain sets the pace, not the people. By the time they secured her, she had already lost consciousness. She did not respond after that point. Her body was recovered 3 days later, once conditions improved enough for a safe retrieval. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, with severe hypothermia as a contributing factor. Delayed timing, prolonged exposure, and exhaustion were also noted. Looking at how it unfolded, it all traces back to that early decision. Starting late didn't seem critical at the time, but up there, small choices don't stay small for long. The date was May 11th, 2017, at Camp 3 on Everest's Lhotse Face, where Jennifer Crane was staging what she described to her 87,000 Instagram followers as the most authentic summit content the platform had ever seen. Jennifer, a 44-year-old lifestyle influencer from Los Angeles, had spent 23 months preparing for Everest, not through technical training or accumulating high-altitude experience, but through crafting a narrative that positioned her climb as a journey of female empowerment and breaking beauty standards in extreme sports. Her expedition had been partially funded through sponsorship deals with athletic wear companies attracted to her audience demographics. The climbing itself was secondary to the documentation. Jennifer's equipment list included 3 cameras, a professional-grade drone intended for use at lower camps, portable LED lighting panels, and backup battery packs that together weighed 19 pounds. Her assigned Sherpa, Ngima Kusang, 36, with 9 Everest summits, had been hired not primarily to guide her climb, but to serve as cameraman, assistant, and content producer. The arrangement had been specified in Jennifer's contract with the expedition company. Ngima would be responsible for filming her on the route, capturing key moments at camps, and ensuring she had footage suitable for the documentary-style videos she produced. Ngima accepted the arrangement because the pay was 40% higher than standard guiding rates, money he needed to fund his daughter's education and medical care for his aging parents. What he had not foreseen was the extent to which Jennifer's content requirements would override basic safety protocols. The problems began during acclimatization rotations, when Jennifer insisted Sherpa's pause load carries to film her ascending fixed ropes with proper lighting and camera angles. What should have been 4-hour climbs stretched to 7 hours as Jennifer demanded retakes and alternate compositions. At Camp 2, she required Ngima to stage sequences showing her melting snow for water, preparing meals, and checking equipment, all tasks normally handled by Sherpas, to create the impression of self-sufficiency for her audience. The staging consumed hours during rest periods when climbers needed to rehydrate and recover. When Ngima explained that extended time at altitude without proper rest increased physiological stress and reduced summit chances, Jennifer responded that content quality was non-negotiable. Her sponsors expected deliverables, and her audience deserved authentic documentation of her journey. The summit push began from Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 17th. Conditions were unusually stable. Clear skies, light winds, and temperatures hovering near -30 degrees. Jennifer had been explicit about her content requirements for Summit Day. She wanted footage of herself climbing above the south summit, reaching the summit ridge with the sunrise behind her, and capturing emotional moments that would convey the significance of her achievement. The climb proceeded smoothly until they reached the balcony at 27,600 feet. Dawn was approaching, and the sky was shifting from black to the deep blue of high-altitude pre-dawn. Jennifer noticed the lighting conditions and decided they needed to stop for an extended photo session. She set up her camera on a small tripod, adjusted settings for low light, and spent 45 minutes recording selfies and video segments against the changing sky. Other climbers passed them on the fixed line, moving steadily upward while conditions held. Ngima warned her repeatedly that they were burning turnaround time, the predetermined hour by which climbers needed to be descending, regardless of whether they had summited. Turnaround times existed because afternoon weather often deteriorated. Temperatures dropped rapidly as the sun declined, and exhausted climbers caught high on the mountain after dark faced dramatically increased mortality risk. Jennifer responded that she understood the guidelines, but that her situation was different. She felt strong, she believed she was climbing well, and the content opportunities created by the light were too valuable to sacrifice to what she called arbitrary timelines. They reached the summit at 9:40 a.m., more than 2 hours past the recommended turnaround time. Jennifer spent 57 minutes on top, conducting an extended photo and video session, recording messages for sponsors, and capturing the emotional content she had promised her audience. Ngima urged her to begin descending, explaining they were now critically behind schedule and that the descent would be slow and grueling. Jennifer dismissed his concerns as excessive caution and continued filming until she was satisfied. The descent began at 10:37 a.m. Jennifer's pace immediately slowed, her movements heavy and uncoordinated, as exhaustion and accumulated oxygen debt caught up with her. The technical sections demanded precise foot placement and sustained concentration, but her focus wandered. She stopped frequently to rest, each pause lasting longer as her body struggled to meet basic demands. By 2 p.m., descending above the south summit at roughly 28,400 feet, temperatures had dropped sharply and wind had begun to build. By 4 p.m., with darkness 3 hours away, they were still above 28,000 feet. Jennifer stopped responding coherently to questions, her answers delayed and confused. She sat down in the snow and said she needed to rest. When Ngima tried to help her stand, she pushed his hands away weakly, her movements uncoordinated. The temperature continued to fall as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Ngima tried everything. He hauled Jennifer to her feet and supported her weight while attempting to walk her downward. He slapped her face to stimulate alertness. He increased her oxygen flow and held the mask tight to her face. Nothing restored function. Her core temperature was dropping, her muscles were spent, and her brain was shutting down from prolonged hypoxia. By 6 p.m., in full darkness, with only headlamps for navigation, Jennifer Crane lost consciousness completely. Jennifer died at approximately 8:20 p.m. on May 18, 2017, at roughly 28,300 feet. The cause of death was later attributed to hypothermia, following prolonged exposure and delayed descent, compounded by hypoxic cerebral edema. Ngima descended alone through the night, suffering severe frostbite to 7 fingers after hours spent working barehanded or with compromised gloves while trying to save her. The damage left him with reduced grip strength and sensation, making high-altitude work dangerous. He returned to guiding 18 months later, but never regained full function in his hands. It was February 14, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience, and relied entirely on previous mild season-guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was June 27, 2017, at Angel's Landing, where the final approach required hikers to navigate a narrow sandstone ridge, 5,790 feet above sea level, exposed on both sides with only partial chains for protection. Maribel Quent, 34, owned a boutique clothing store in San Diego and frequently shared curated travel photos online. Though she had moderate hiking experience, her focus was more on capturing the perfect shot than following safety rules. From what I see, her priority wasn't the summit, it was the photograph. The final half mile of the trail is a narrow ridge with drop-offs exceeding 1,000 feet. By midday, temperatures had climbed to around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The sandstone surfaces were polished from years of foot traffic, with smooth areas made even more slippery by a thin layer of sand blown across the trail by the wind. Chains were available in some of the most exposed sections, but large portions of the ridge remained unprotected, relying entirely on hikers' judgment and careful movement. Even under normal conditions, this ridge can be unforgiving. Add a layer of loose sand and heat, and one misstep is all it takes. Signs posted along the trail warned hikers to stay on the designated path and avoid venturing onto unprotected ledges. Rangers that morning had briefed visitors on recent incidents involving photographers stepping off trail. Maribel had heard the warnings, but dismissed them as excessive. She moved beyond the chain several times to adjust for better shots, shifting her stance and testing the edges to get the right angle. From where I'm looking, it probably seemed harmless to her at the time. But on a narrow, exposed ridge like that, every extra step onto unstable ground made an accident far more likely. As she neared the summit, she spotted a ledge about 8 feet beyond the official trail that promised a clear, unobstructed view of the valley below. From a distance, it looked stable, but it was sloped and covered in loose sand. Maribel stepped past the boundary rope and moved toward the ledge, testing each foot placement carefully, but missing how the surface could shift beneath her. Her camera bag, weighing roughly 12 pounds, subtly shifted her center of gravity, forcing her to lean forward slightly to maintain balance. Here, you can see how even a small shift in weight or footing can completely change your stability. Those few extra pounds made the difference. Sandstone beneath her was smooth, with almost no texture to grip. As she adjusted for the photo, her right foot began to slide on the sand. She tried to correct, but instead accelerated the movement. Her hands reached for a hold, but the smooth rock offered nothing to grab. Within seconds, she was sliding uncontrollably toward the edge. Momentum carried her over the precipice. Witnesses reported she disappeared from view almost instantly. The fall was estimated at roughly 1,000 feet. That moment is almost impossible to stop once it begins. One slip and gravity takes over. It's a brutal reminder of how thin the line is between safe and fatal. Other hikers immediately alerted park rangers via emergency communications. Immediate rescue was impossible due to the exposed terrain, so recovery waited until conditions allowed a helicopter later that afternoon. Death was confirmed as instantaneous from blunt force trauma, with contributing factors including leaving the trail unstable, footing, and extra weight from her camera. It's striking how fast it happened. A few missteps off the trail, and that was enough. Everything else just made it worse. The incident received little public attention, noted only in seasonal park reports, serving as a reminder that even routine hikes can turn fatal when safety boundaries are ignored. Looking back, the decision to prioritize a photograph over safety stands out clearly. It's easy to think you can handle this, but the mountain doesn't negotiate. That's what makes incidents like this so sobering. The consequences arrive before you even realize the danger. It was October 12th, 2017, on a rugged alpine traverse high on Mount Everest's northern mountain system. The day began with clear skies and light autumn wind along an exposed ridgeline above the established high camps. Within a few hours, weather conditions changed sharply, turning the routine traverse into a struggle against violent winds above the tree line. Tony Amiel was 41, a teacher from a northern city who had more than 15 years of hiking experience in mountain regions. He had completed several long alpine traverses before and was known among companions for strong endurance and fast pacing. The intended route spanned a long, exposed corridor across multiple high-altitude peaks, with extended sections where natural shelter from wind and cold was absent. Amiel planned to complete the traverse within a single day, aiming to finish before the season's first major storm system reached the upper mountain. Weather advisories warned that wind speeds would increase during the day. Despite the warning, he began hiking, wearing light, movement-efficient clothing suited for rapid travel. Conditions worsened as he advanced along the ridgeline. Other climbers reported seeing him moving steadily across open mountain sections, while cloud cover thickened across surrounding peaks. Wind strength had already become sufficient to move loose gravel across bare rock surfaces, creating unstable footing for hikers carrying equipment. He sent a final communication stating that wind conditions were becoming more severe, but that he intended to continue. Afterward, he entered an exposed saddle section, consisting of wide granite slabs bordered by steep, unprotected drop zones. As the day progressed, wind gusts intensified to levels commonly associated with extreme alpine storm systems. Such wind speeds are capable of destabilizing a standing climber, particularly when moving across ice-slickened rock while carrying a backpack. The combination of wind pressure and uneven terrain caused repeated loss of balance. Witnesses later observed the climber being pushed off the marked path several times by strong sideways wind forces, requiring significant effort each time to regain footing before moving forward. Shortly afterward, a powerful wind surge swept across the ridge corridor. The granite surface had developed a thin layer of ice formed from moisture freezing under continuous cold airflow. The exposed slab section had no rope protection, vegetation, or nearby rock formations capable of reducing wind impact. The terrain provided very little friction, making stable movement increasingly difficult. The climber was eventually knocked to the ground by wind force. Search personnel later identified scrape marks and displaced gravel near the trail boundary, suggesting multiple attempts to stand while maintaining balance. An ice axe was recovered downslope with deep scoring on the blade edge, consistent with repeated contact against bare rock during attempts to slow a downward slide. The terrain near the drainage slope descends sharply into fractured granite walls and stacked rock ledges. Once momentum developed on the ice-covered stone surface, controlling downward movement became extremely difficult. The climber was carried toward the cliff boundary and fell a significant vertical distance down the rocky drainage zone, striking multiple protruding rock formations during the descent. Emergency response teams were notified immediately, but sustained high winds made helicopter access unsafe. Ground search teams waited until wind strength decreased later that night before beginning recovery operations. The approach to the ravine area required cautious movement across unstable mountain terrain. The climber was located several hundred feet below the trail in a rocky drainage valley. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from the fall, with hypothermia and prolonged environmental exposure as contributing factors. The incident was later used in mountain safety education programs to illustrate how rapid weather changes in high-altitude environments can transform ordinary traverses into life-threatening situations within a short time. On Everest's upper mountains, open ridges, extreme wind exposure, and ice formation can quickly eliminate safe movement margins. By April 27, 2016, the Khumbu icefall shimmered in the pre-dawn cold, its chaotic labyrinth of ice blocks and crevasses rendered temporarily more stable by overnight temperatures that had dropped well below zero. The route through the icefall had been established and continuously adjusted by rope-fixing teams over the previous weeks, marked with wands and equipped with aluminum ladders spanning the widest crevasses. Protocol required climbers to move through the most dangerous sections during the coldest hours, typically departing base camp between 2 and 4 a.m. to limit exposure beneath seracs that grew increasingly unstable as sunlight warmed the ice. Sandra Voss, a 52-year-old attorney from Chicago, objected to that schedule. She had paid $82,000 for her Everest expedition and challenged the departure times during the first icefall rotation briefing. When the expedition leader, Pemba Rinzing, explained that teams would leave base camp at 3 a.m. to pass through the icefall during the safest conditions, Sandra stated she would not take part in early departures. She slept poorly at altitude. Mornings were difficult for her, and she intended to cross later in the day when she felt more functional. Pemba explained that afternoon, crossings were strongly discouraged because rising temperatures destabilized seracs and increased the likelihood of collapse. Sandra responded that she had researched icefall conditions, watched footage of climbers crossing at various times of day, and believed the risk was overstated, an overly conservative practice that no longer reflected modern conditions. Her assigned Sherpas were Karsang Bhote, 39, with 13 Everest summits, and Chewang Tsering, 28, with 6. Both had worked in the icefall for years and had lost colleagues there. When Karsang attempted to explain why early departures were standard, Sandra interrupted with a series of pointed questions. She asked what data supported the policy, what meteorological models were being used, and whether accident rates had been formally compared across different crossing times. The questions were delivered rapidly in the style of a deposition. Karsang answered calmly, describing observations gathered over hundreds of crossings and years of experience watching ice behavior shift with temperature. He referenced past incidents that occurred during warm conditions. Sandra dismissed the explanations as anecdotal. Over the following week, Sandra escalated the matter. She submitted written complaints to the expedition company alleging excessive safety restrictions. She contacted the government liaison officer assigned to the expedition and argued that the departure requirements were arbitrary and not explicitly stated in her contract. She also raised the possibility of legal action if the company tried to enforce them. The company did not grant approval for afternoon crossings, but they documented their objections and informed Sandra that they would not physically prevent her from proceeding against recommendations if she signed an additional waiver acknowledging she was acting against explicit safety advice. Sandra signed the waiver and announced she would make her first icefall crossing during the afternoon of May 3rd. Karsang and Chewang were assigned to accompany her. Declining the assignment would have meant forfeiting pay and risking future contracts. They checked their equipment repeatedly and discussed contingency plans in Nepali while Sandra spoke with other climbers about her decision. The crossing began shortly after 2 p.m. under bright sunlight. Base camp temperatures had climbed into the high 30s, and the icefall was audibly active. Sharp cracks echoed across the glacier, and deep groans emanated from within the seracs. Sandra moved steadily across flat sections and cautiously over ladders. Karsang traveled ahead on the fixed rope, with Chewang behind. They were roughly halfway through the icefall, passing beneath a towering serac when the ice began to fail. A tearing sound came from inside the structure. The lower section separated from the main body, tipping forward before accelerating into collapse. Karsang shouted a warning in Nepali, but there was no time to move. Ice fell in blocks ranging from the size of appliances to small vehicles, breaking apart on impact. The debris spread across nearly 200 feet of the route. Witnesses later said Sandra looked up just before the ice struck her. Karsang was thrown sideways by debris, slammed into the ice, and sustained severe spinal injuries. Chewang, positioned farther back, was knocked to the ground by flying ice and the pressure wave, suffering lacerations and a fractured wrist. When the collapse ended, Sandra Voss was no longer visible. Other climbers and Sherpas moved into the debris field immediately, digging with shovels and ice axes and shifting blocks by hand where machinery could not reach. Within hours, it was clear the effort had become a recovery operation. Sandra's body was located buried deep beneath compacted ice, her injuries unsurvivable. Chewang recovered fully. Karsang required surgery for his spinal injuries and never returned to high-altitude climbing. It was May 9th, 2015, at Camp 2 on Mount Everest, 21,300 feet up. Thin air, minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, hidden crevasses, and icy patches made every step risky. One misstep could be deadly. Tessa Crane, 37, worked as a corporate consultant in Chicago. She thrived on pushing herself in high-pressure situations and expected that same drive to carry her up Everest. She had climbed several 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, but nothing had prepared her for the sustained physiological stress of staying above 18,000 feet. 18 months of training had convinced her she could handle the climb. I can see she trusted her mental toughness more than her body's signals. That's a mistake a lot of people make up here, thinking willpower is enough. Altitude sickness often begins subtly, a headache, mild nausea, dizziness. But at 21,000 feet, these early signs can escalate rapidly. On the morning of May 9th, Tessa reported a mild headache and slight nausea, but insisted she could continue to Camp 3. Her guide recommended immediate descent to Camp 1. She refused. I get it. She probably felt like stopping would mean failure. But up here, ignoring your body is never worth it. Over the next several hours, her condition worsened. The headache intensified intensified. Nausea turned into repeated vomiting, and dizziness made each step uncertain. The cold and wind made rest stops. Exhausting, slowing the team even more. Every fixed rope she gripped required extra effort, and her balance became progressively unreliable. I can't help thinking how small decisions start stacking up. The choice to push forward despite the warning signs is one that snowballs quickly. By early afternoon, Tessa had developed high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where fluid buildup in the brain causes swelling that impairs thinking, coordination, and consciousness. Her steps were unsteady, her grip on ropes weakened, and she needed constant support from the guides. On a steep section between Camp 2 and 3, she collapsed entirely, unable to move on her own. Breathing became irregular, supplemental oxygen barely helped, and the technical terrain made any descent slow and risky. It's kinda terrifying seeing someone so prepared and determined get beaten by altitude. You train and prep for months, but the mountain has its own rules. The guides worked carefully to move her down, securing ropes and taking each step slowly. Her intermittent consciousness made coordination impossible, and at times, she was completely unresponsive. Weather conditions and steep slopes prevented a rapid evacuation. I can't imagine how helpless it must feel to watch, knowing every second counts, but there's only so much you can do at that height. Hours passed as her condition deteriorated. The guides monitored her vitals and tried to prevent further decline, but the combination of brain swelling, hypoxia, and physical exhaustion progressed beyond the point where rescue alone could reverse it. Eventually, she lost consciousness permanently. It's sobering. There's no arguing with physiology at this altitude. The body just shuts down when it can't cope. The medical officer later confirmed the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors including her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared and the delayed recognition of the severity of her condition. It's hard not to reflect on how quickly a summit goal can turn deadly when pride or determination overrides basic survival instincts. Her death was documented in the expedition's medical logs and reported to Nepalese authorities, as is required for all climbing fatalities. It's a harsh reminder that the mountain isn't forgiving. No amount of preparation, money, or drive changes the fact that ignoring the body's signals can be fatal. Even after the incident, the evidence left on the route, abandoned gear, disturbed snow, and the path where she struggled, served as a stark visual cue for future climbers about how quickly things can go wrong. Looking at it, I can't help but feel the weight of those final hours. The effort, the willpower, all of it, and yet the body had the final say. That's something that really sticks with you about high-altitude climbing. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton, focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. In today's episode, we look at egoistic Karens whose entitlement and ego led them to push limits on Everest, and paid the price for it. From attempting untested direct climbing lines on unstable faces to climbing through storms and altitude illness just to chase records, their decisions left almost no margin for survival. It was September 14th, 2015, at a high camp zone on Mount Everest's West Ridge approach, where sustained winds carried spindrift across exposed slopes and sub-zero air moved through layered expedition tents. The upper mountain was obscured by ground blizzard conditions, and most climbing teams reinforced camp structures while waiting for a safer weather window. Charlie Rayos was a 34-year-old corporate attorney from Denver who had taken up mountaineering 3 years earlier. She had built confidence on lower mountain climbs in Colorado, and one guided ascent above 15,000 feet. But she had never spent prolonged time above 17,000 feet, traveled solo across glacier terrain, or navigated whiteout conditions independently. Rayos declined expedition guide services for Everest's upper mountain, describing turnaround delays and weather holds as unnecessary caution rather than essential safety measures, and questioned delayed summit schedules and described rest windows as wasted opportunity. She expressed strong confidence that physical conditioning and equipment preparation would compensate for worsening environmental conditions. Above 17,000 feet on Everest, the route narrows into an exposed ridge bordered by steep drop zones and crevasse fields. Oxygen concentration is roughly half of sea level, impairing judgment and slowing reaction time. The route depends on marker wands identifying the safest traversal line. During whiteout conditions, those markers can be buried under drifting snow, removing reliable visual orientation. On the morning of September 14th, a high wind advisory was issued for the upper mountain. Most teams remained inside camp. Shortly after sunrise, Rayos left alone, leaving a note stating she was going for it regardless. She advanced toward the summit ridge without a rope team, while visibility was near zero. Navigation data later showed that by mid-morning, she had drifted significantly away from the established route. Track patterns suggested disorientation, with repeated course corrections consistent with whiteout confusion. With sky and ground blending into a uniform gray field, loss of horizon reference likely accelerated navigational error under hypoxic stress. Spindrift snow gradually filled shallow depressions along the glacier's surface, obscuring crevasse boundaries and softening visual texture across the route. Investigators later determined that Rios likely traversed what appeared to be a gently sloping surface while attempting to return to the established summit corridor. However, the path she entered was the upper entrance of a steep couloir that diverged from the main climbing line. The channel consisted of wind-compacted blue ice hidden beneath a thin layer of loose powder snow, terminating abruptly at a vertical cliff band below. Footprints near the rollover point indicated a brief pause before she committed weight onto the descending slope. Within several steps, the underlying ice surface provided insufficient traction, causing her crampons to lose secure contact with the ground. An ice axe was later recovered embedded downslope, showing scoring marks consistent with at least one controlled attempt to arrest the fall. However, the combination of hardened ice, steep gradient, and altitude-related motor impairment significantly reduced friction and mechanical stopping capability. As momentum increased, she slid uncontrollably along the frozen channel. Impact disturbances were documented along the descent path, showing repeated collisions with protruding rock surfaces embedded within the couloir wall. The slide trajectory eventually carried her over the cliff band edge, initiating a free fall phase across a substantial vertical drop. During the fall, she struck multiple exposed rock outcrops along the mountain wall, which contributed to severe traumatic injury before reaching the lower slope zone. An automatic emergency beacon activated shortly afterward. Helicopter rescue was impossible due to sustained high winds and poor visibility. A ground search team reached the area the following day when conditions improved and traced the slide path over the edge. Rios's body was located at the base of the cliff using probing equipment. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from multiple fall impacts, with hypothermia and altitude-related impairment listed as contributing factors. The incident was officially recorded as a weather-related solo fatality on Everest's upper mountain. It was May 21st, 2018, on Everest's summit ridge at 28,500 feet, deep in the death zone where humans can survive only hours. Temperatures hit minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen dropped to 30% of sea level, and the exposed ridge left no room for error. Every step demanded precise energy and oxygen management, and even small mistakes could be fatal. Karen Dolev, 42, worked as a marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company in Dallas. She had built her career on exceeding targets and refusing to accept limits, and she brought that same mindset to Everest. Her climbing resume included Denali and Aconcagua, but she had never spent extended periods above 25,000 feet, where the human body deteriorates quickly, regardless of fitness. She approached the expedition like a professional objective, measurable, attainable, and under her control, but the mountain operates on a different rule set. You can't negotiate with the altitude. It doesn't care how determined you are. The summit ridge is one of the most dangerous parts of the entire climb. Even with supplemental oxygen, climbers must adhere to strict turnaround times, usually between noon and 2 p.m., to allow for safe descent. Guides enforce these rules because the margin for error is minuscule. Afternoon conditions often deteriorate rapidly, winds increase, and visibility drops. Karen had been moving aggressively throughout the ascent, consuming oxygen at a higher than average rate. She was still 400 vertical feet below the summit, already behind the schedule that would have ensured survival. At this point, I could tell that pushing forward was becoming more than just risky. It was straight up life-threatening. When her guide ordered the turnaround, she refused. Karen argued that she was close enough to the summit to continue safely, pointing to other climbers still ascending. She treated the instructions as suggestions rather than life-saving rules. Her oxygen supply was insufficient for both the ascent and a safe descent, but she dismissed the calculations. It's hard not to see this as classic summit fever. The investment, the ego, the mindset that success outweighs survival. Against explicit warnings, she pressed on. By early afternoon, the weather turned faster than forecasted. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour, snow drove horizontally, and visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Her oxygen supply reached critically low levels, forcing her to ration what little remained. Reduced oxygen combined with extreme exertion slowed her movement and impaired coordination. Every step required focus she could no longer fully summon. Watching a climber like this You realize that determination alone can't replace oxygen or timing. It becomes cruelly obvious how fragile the human body is up here. Approximately 200 feet below the summit, Karen's supplemental oxygen was effectively gone. She relied solely on the ambient air, which cannot sustain life at this altitude for long. Hypoxia set in quickly. Confusion, poor balance, and impaired judgment made steady movement impossible. Cold exposure accelerated hypothermia, and she collapsed repeatedly along the ridge. It's a harsh reality. At this height, the environment will win if you ignore the rules. Survival isn't negotiable. Other climbers nearby were also fighting for survival and could not provide meaningful help. Rescue was impossible given the extreme wind, low temperatures, and exposure on the ridge. Karen became stranded, and her body slowly shut down under the combined effects of hypoxia and hypothermia. It's sobering to think how quickly the situation escalates. The summit seems so close, yet the death zone doesn't forgive hesitation or defiance. Despite desperate attempts by nearby climbers to offer support, she never regained consciousness. Her body succumbed to oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. Recovery was only possible later in the season, when conditions allowed safe access. The expedition's medical officer ruled the cause of death as hypoxia complicated by severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including refusal to follow turnaround times and mismanagement of oxygen. The incident was documented in climbing summaries as a reminder of the deadly consequences of ignoring protocols in the death zone. Karen's drive to reach the summit, the same force that fueled her professional achievements, had prevented her from recognizing when retreat was the only way to survive. At that altitude, ambition and determination don't change the outcome. The conditions don't adjust to the climber, and exceeding physical limits at that altitude leads to rapid decline. It was June 23, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where unusually warm pre-monsoon temperatures hung in the air. The tent city buzzed with climbers preparing gear and rotations, while thin air carried the sense of stoves, glacier ice, and yak meat, and prayer flags snapped against the Khumbu Glacier. Kendall Wexford, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Seattle. She had built her career on aggressive efficiency, refusing to accept delays or limitations, and approached mountaineering with the same mindset. Wexford's experience included moderate peaks in Nepal and the Pacific Northwest, but none involved technical glacier travel, rope team coordination, or high-altitude hazards above 20,000 feet. She had hired a mid-tier Nepali guiding company and considered their role primarily as logistical support rather than technical instructors, viewing safety protocols as optional barriers to completing her summit push-on schedule. Wexford repeatedly dismissed concerns about warm temperatures and unstable snow bridges, arguing that speed and efficiency were more important than caution. Over the following days, she ignored standard rope team procedures, skipped team briefings, criticized base camp logistics, and insisted on advancing ahead to demonstrate her preferred pace, leaving guides frustrated and increasingly concerned for her safety. The first glacier rotation to Camp 1 exposed the risks of her approach. Crossing crevasse fields at high altitude, Wexford hesitated and rushed intermittently, ignoring probe testing. Her guides attempted to enforce rope travel and spacing, but she unroped herself and advanced ahead. Warm conditions had softened snow bridges, making them unpredictable under weight. At Camp 1, she demanded minimal rest and insisted the team maintain her schedule, dismissing recommendations to pause until ice and snow conditions stabilized. On the second rotation toward Camp 2, Wexford continued to flout standard safety protocols. She pressured her guides to increase the pace, skipped proper spacing in the rope team, and refused to probe or test snow bridges at critical crevasse crossings. Even under repeated warnings, she insisted on advancing alone, ignoring flexing snow bridges and the unstable conditions caused by unusually warm temperatures at high altitude. While crossing a visibly weakened snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, the structure collapsed beneath her, sending her plunging into the narrow chasm. During the fall, she struck sharp ice edges and a protruding rock shelf, fracturing both femurs and sustaining severe internal trauma. Her backpack and helmet shifted violently, causing additional blunt force injuries as she tumbled against the crevasse walls. The crevasse was too narrow for rescuers to see her directly, and the high walls reflected sound poorly, making communication nearly impossible. Her headlamp illuminated only a small area around her, revealing snow debris and ice shards, but no stable footing. Blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma caused her to lose consciousness within 20 minutes, leaving her completely dependent on technical rescue teams to reach her before prolonged exposure worsened her condition. The guides immediately initiated crevasse rescue procedures, but warm snow and unstable anchors significantly slowed operations. A satellite call to coordinate additional support confirmed that helicopter evacuation was impossible due to rotor hazards over the narrow opening. Ground-based technical rescue teams required 4 hours to reach the location with specialized equipment. Wexford's body was recovered at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined death was due to massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, with contributing factors including bilateral femur fractures and early hypothermia from exposure. The incident reinforced the extreme hazards of high-altitude glacier travel in unstable conditions and underscored the necessity of strict adherence to guide authority and rope team protocols. Expedition companies subsequently revised safety agreements to prevent clients from overriding technical instructions during hazardous climbs. April 22, 2015, during the pre-expedition briefing at a hotel in Kathmandu, was when Rebecca Hartman first lied about her climbing experience. Rebecca, a 49-year-old pharmaceutical executive from Boston, had built a successful career through confidence and the strategic presentation of credentials. When the expedition leader asked about previous high-altitude experience, Rebecca offered a list of summits that included Denali, Aconcagua, and Elbrus, all peaks above 18,000 feet that suggested legitimate preparation for Everest. The list was fabricated. Rebecca's actual climbing experience consisted of a single guided trek up Kilimanjaro 3 years earlier, and a weekend mountaineering course in New Hampshire that covered basic crampon technique and ice axe use. She had researched Everest qualification standards, identified the mountains most commonly cited as prerequisites, and added them to her resume with sufficient detail to sound credible. The deception worked because commercial Everest expeditions operated on trust, reinforced by financial incentive. Rebecca had paid her $79,000 fee in full, arrived with appropriate equipment, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who appeared to know what she was doing. Her assigned Sherpa was Dawa Temba, 41, with 14 Everest summits, who recognized during the first acclimatization rotation that Rebecca had lied about everything. Her crampon technique was uncertain, her balance on steep terrain was poor, and her breathing patterns reflected someone with no meaningful experience at altitude. Dawa reported his concerns to expedition leadership, and was told that unless Rebecca became clearly unable to continue, the expedition would proceed as contracted. She had signed comprehensive waivers, and her claimed experience had not been independently verified before her payment was accepted. Rebecca's approach to acclimatization revealed the depth of her ignorance. During the second planned rotation to Camp 1, she turned around early and skipped the upper portion entirely, stating she felt sufficiently acclimated and saw no need to waste energy on what she described as redundant training climbs. When Dawa explained that acclimatization rotations were not training exercises but physiological adaptation, that the body required repeated exposure to progressively higher altitudes to boost red blood cell production and adjust to hypoxic conditions, Rebecca dismissed the explanation as outdated thinking. During the rotation to Camp 2, Rebecca struggled severely but attributed her difficulties to temporary fatigue rather than inadequate preparation. She moved slowly across the western CWM, stopping frequently and sitting in the snow for extended rest periods. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her face flushed despite the cold, and her coordination was poor. At Camp 2, she slept badly and woke with a severe headache that she treated with ibuprofen, insisting to Dawa that the symptoms were minor and would clear up with rest. The following night, Rebecca's breathing became labored even while lying in her sleeping bag. Dawa could hear the wet, rattling sound that indicated fluid accumulating in the lungs, high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition in which plasma leaks from blood vessels into lung tissue, impairing oxygen exchange and progressively drowning the victim from the inside. He entered her tent and found her sitting upright because lying flat made breathing impossible, her lips tinged blue, her skin cold and clammy. When he stated clearly that she had pulmonary edema and required immediate descent to lower altitude, Rebecca refused. She had traveled too far and invested too much to quit over symptoms she believed would resolve on their own. She demanded supplemental oxygen and medication instead of descent. Dawa explained that descent was the only effective treatment, that oxygen could temporarily ease symptoms but would not reverse the underlying condition, and that without descent, she could die within hours. Rebecca accused him of exaggerating the danger to avoid the inconvenience of supporting her continued climb. By midnight, Rebecca's condition had deteriorated to the point where choice was no longer relevant. She had lost the ability to walk without support and was coughing up pink, frothy sputum, a definitive sign of advanced pulmonary edema. Dawa and 2 other Sherpas began emergency evacuation, supporting her weight between them as they moved downward toward Camp 1. Rebecca Hartman died shortly after evacuation efforts began in the early morning hours of May 6, 2015, above Camp 1. Her lungs had filled with fluid, and respiratory failure led to cardiac arrest under the combined strain of hypoxia and extreme physiological stress. The official cause of death was listed as high-altitude pulmonary edema, compounded by inadequate acclimatization. It was November 3, 2013, on the north face of Mount Everest during the late autumn season. Snow whipped across the mountain, cutting visibility to just a few feet. Only the most experienced teams remained as winter conditions began setting in. Leanda Berungela, 41, a fitness entrepreneur from Miami Beach, had built her career on high-intensity training and motivational content about pushing limits. She had summited several major peaks solo and prided herself on her independence. Everest was meant to be the culmination of her climbing career, proving that her mental toughness methodology could conquer any challenge. Above 26,000 feet, navigation depends on following established routes marked by fixed ropes and anchor points. Weather can change in seconds, turning a simple path into a deadly cliff. Guides rely on GPS, rope systems, and landmarks to keep climbers safe, especially in low visibility zones. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for me to get disoriented up there, even if I thought I knew the route. One wrong step in that whiteout could be fatal. Base camp had issued repeated warnings about the worsening weather and stressed the importance of staying in sight of assigned guides. Radio check-ins every 15 minutes were mandatory to ensure no one became separated from the group. Berunguela had clashed with her guide throughout the expedition, criticizing his slow pace and insisting her fitness and experience allowed her to move independently. Despite repeated warnings, she pressed ahead whenever possible, convinced she could navigate on her own. During the summit attempt, visibility dropped below 10 feet as blowing snow and thick clouds turned the mountain into a uniform wall of white. The team moved carefully, using fixed ropes and staying within sight of each other. But Berunguela grew frustrated with each pause, seeing safety measures as unnecessary delays. At a critical transition between 2 fixed-line sections, she chose to move ahead alone rather than wait for her guide to complete safety checks. I kept imagining myself in that situation, thinking I could handle it on my own, and how quickly confidence could turn into real danger. Confident in her memory and navigation skills, she ignored calls to halt and pressed forward. Within minutes, she lost sight of the team and the fixed ropes. Her radio calls grew increasingly urgent as she realized she could no longer identify landmarks or follow the established path. The extreme cold soon took a serious toll. Her GPS failed in the freezing temperatures, leaving her without a reliable way to navigate. She tried retracing her steps, but the endless white landscape offered no clear points of reference. Snow drifted over tracks, and the uniform terrain made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Her guide's radio calls went unanswered as she pressed forward, relying on failing memory and instinct. As hours passed, the weather worsened with strong winds and blowing snow, reducing visibility to near zero. Berunguela unknowingly entered a high-risk avalanche zone. Hypothermia drained her strength, and altitude sickness clouded her judgment. Her calls for help grew weaker, movement slowed, and the mountain's dangers closed in, turning the climb into a desperate struggle for survival. Search teams found her body 4 days later, nearly a mile off the main route. She had spent over 18 hours in the death zone, succumbing to exposure and exhaustion. Her equipment was scattered, showing she had tried to signal for help. I couldn't stop thinking about how one small mistake can get you completely turned around, and how being stubborn alone on the mountain can quickly become dangerous. The coroner confirmed death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing factors including altitude sickness and dehydration. Her final coordinates showed she had been moving in circles, unable to find the main route. The incident underscored the importance of maintaining team cohesion in extreme conditions. Personal strength and determination could not replace teamwork and adherence to proven safety protocols. Fitness industry publications covered the tragedy, noting the fatal consequences of ignoring guidance in extreme environments. Following the incident, her motivational brand quietly disappeared from social media. The mountain had claimed another climber who believed personal excellence could substitute for collaboration, patience, and strict adherence to survival strategies. It was June 8, 2014, on the upper glacier route of Mount Everest above the high camps. At approximately 14,200 feet, a climber was moving along a heavily traveled summit corridor known for thin air, crevasse exposure, and rapidly changing Himalayan weather. What began as a summit attempt soon turned into a medical emergency in the death zone. Penelope Love was 38, a fitness trainer from Seattle who believed physical conditioning could overcome high-altitude limitations. She had completed several lower elevation climbs in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Baker and Mount Hood, but had never climbed above 11,000 feet before attempting Everest. Acquaintances described her as highly confident in endurance training, but dismissive of high-altitude physiology. She reportedly referred to altitude sickness as a mind-over-body problem rather than a medical condition. Her objective was to reach the summit in 3 days instead of following the recommended multi-day acclimatization schedule commonly used on Everest. The route required an ascent of roughly 9,000 feet from base areas to the upper mountain zones, where atmospheric oxygen levels dropped to nearly half of sea level concentration. Above 10,000 feet, rapid ascent can trigger high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition caused by fluid accumulation and swelling inside brain tissue under oxygen deprivation. Climbing guides stationed at a mid-mountain camp observed Love developing early symptoms of altitude illness. Reports indicated she complained of persistent headache and nausea, but continued climbing after taking repeated doses of over-the-counter pain medication. Guides advised spending an additional day acclimatizing before moving higher, but she declined, stating she felt physically strong enough to continue. Other climbers moving along the same route later reported seeing Love walking unsteadily across exposed glacier sections. Witnesses described moments of slowed reaction time, occasional confusion, and difficulty maintaining stable balance on uneven ice. Her climbing partner attempted to encourage descent after noticing behavioral changes consistent with altitude impairment, but Love insisted that fatigue was the only issue. Near the final approach zone toward the upper summit corridor, Love suddenly collapsed and began vomiting repeatedly. Her partner attempted to assist her toward lower elevation, but neurological symptoms worsened quickly. Observed behavior was consistent with severe high-altitude cerebral edema, including disorientation, agitation, and loss of coordination. Shortly afterward, she lost consciousness. Emergency descent procedures were initiated by her partner, who attempted basic life support while moving downhill. During the descent, Love experienced seizure-like muscle contractions as brain swelling likely increased intracranial pressure. Her breathing became irregular and eventually stopped despite continued resuscitation attempts. The time between collapse and cardiopulmonary failure was estimated at roughly 2 hours. Terrain difficulty, extreme altitude, and physical exhaustion limited emergency response effectiveness. Helicopter evacuation was attempted, but thin air density, strong winds, and mountain topography prevented aircraft access to the high elevation zone. Ground rescue personnel reached the location after conditions stabilized. Love was pronounced dead at approximately 13,800 feet elevation. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, with brain swelling causing respiratory failure. Post-mortem analysis confirmed advanced HACE progression, and investigators noted that early warning symptoms such as headache, vomiting, irritability, and coordination loss were present but were not acted upon. The case became part of mountaineering safety education materials, reinforcing that physical fitness cannot prevent altitude-related medical failure. In the Everest death zone, the human body operates near physiological limits regardless of training level. As Penelope Love's accident demonstrated the speed at which altitude sickness can progress, another climber in a distant mountain range was approaching a summit zone where environmental hazards would soon test the boundary between endurance and survival. On the morning of April 19, 2015, Everest Base Camp was deep in the critical preparation phase of the pre-monsoon climbing season. The tent city at 17,600 feet thrummed with organized chaos as expedition teams finalized equipment checks and acclimatization plans. Temperatures that morning hovered around 22 degrees Fahrenheit under cloudless skies, and the thin air carried the familiar sense of kerosene stoves, juniper smoke from pujas, and glacier ice. Prayer flags snapped in the wind against the white expanse of the Khumbu Glacier. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Patricia Whitmore, a 47-year-old boutique hotel owner from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had shown up 3 weeks earlier with 16 duffel bags and expectations molded by a career built on luxury service. Patricia had paid $95,000 to a mid-tier Nepali operator and regarded the expedition as a premium experience rather than a technical climb. Her payment came attached to a detailed list of requirements that expedition coordinators initially assumed was a joke. The list included an espresso machine at advanced camps, Egyptian cotton pillowcases, and additional heating equipment. When the expedition leader explained that weight limits above base camp were governed by what Sherpas could physically carry through hazardous terrain, Patricia stated that she had paid for full-service guiding and expected the accommodation to match. The espresso machine alone weighed 14 pounds. Combined with her personal gear, her load exceeded standard allowances by close to 40 pounds. Her assigned Sherpa team consisted of Jahamsi Norbu, 43, a veteran of 16 Everest summits, and Tenzin Dargyal, 31, with 8 ascents. Jahamsa had guided for 19 years and supported 4 children on expedition income. He explained that luxury items could not take priority over oxygen, safety equipment, and group supplies. Patricia pushed back at once, stating that her fee entitled her to service reflecting the cost. After a brief discussion framed around client satisfaction and reputational risk, expedition leader Ong Karma sided with Patricia following her threat to post negative reviews online. The extra weight would be carried. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Patricia spoke to the Sherpas dismissively, criticized base camp meals, complained about her tent placement and washing water, and skipped evening briefings to post updates on her phone. Her interactions centered on comfort and inconvenience rather than rote conditions or safety protocols. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 exposed her limitations. The Khumbu icefall required quick, purposeful movement across ladders and unstable ice. Patricia moved slowly, hesitating at each ladder, crossing and resting frequently on steep sections, extending her exposure well beyond recommended limits. She needed nearly 8 hours to reach Camp 1, arriving during the warmest part of the day. At Camp 1, she demanded her tent be arranged with comfort equipment and her coffee prepared using the espresso machine Jamsi had carried. When he explained that the added weight reduced capacity for oxygen and emergency supplies, Patricia brushed off the concern, stating that he was being paid to provide service, not commentary. The second rotation to Camp 2 followed an identical pattern. Crossing the western CWM in midday heat, Patricia struggled badly, sitting down repeatedly and refusing to continue until she felt ready. Jamsi advised steady movement and hydration, but his warnings went ignored. At Camp 2, her oxygen saturation measured in the high 60s, indicating poor acclimatization. When Jamsi suggested extending the rotation before attempting Camp 3, Patricia refused, citing scheduling obligations and dismissing further delay based on what she described as cautious medical advice. The third rotation began on May 8th, with an ascent of the lower Lhotse face. Patricia's pace deteriorated further, brief movement followed by long stops. She missed routine safety steps, became disoriented, and repeatedly asked where they were and how much remained. At Camp 3, at 23,500 feet, Patricia collapsed into her tent. Jamsi checked her oxygen saturation again and recorded a further drop. Combined with confusion and coordination loss, the symptoms were consistent with developing high-altitude cerebral edema. He explained that immediate descent was essential while she could still walk. Patricia responded with hostility. She accused Jamsi of sabotaging her expedition and claimed the concerns were discriminatory. She ordered him out of her tent. Jamsi radioed base camp, with a detailed report. Expedition leadership replied that unless Patricia became fully incapacitated, the decision to descend remained hers. She had signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks. That night, her condition deteriorated rapidly. By 10 p.m., she suffered severe headaches and confusion. By midnight, she could no longer walk. By 2 a.m., she had lost consciousness. Jomsy and Tenzin began emergency descent procedures, lowering her unresponsive body down the Lhotse face in darkness and sub-zero temperatures. Patricia Whitmore died at approximately 4:15 a.m. on May 9th, 2015, roughly 400 vertical feet below Camp 3. Jomsy confirmed the absence of breathing and pulse during the descent. After hours of exposure in wet boots and extreme cold, he suffered severe frostbite to 3 toes on his left foot. The injuries required partial amputation and ended his high-altitude guiding career. It was April 19th, 2015, in the Khumbu region of Nepal. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, a sprawling collection of colorful tents scattered across the moraine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as climbers moved between expedition camps. Dr. Bonnie Baxter, 47, arrived as part of a commercial expedition of 12 climbers. She had completed 3 high-altitude treks, but Everest was her first technical climb above 24,000 feet. Baxter worked as an emergency room physician and made frequent references to her medical background when questioned about protocols. During the initial safety briefing, she interrupted the lead guide several times to suggest alternative approaches to altitude sickness management. During acclimatization rotations, Baxter questioned the oxygen flow rates recommended by the expedition outfitter. She adjusted her regulator settings based on her own calculations, insisting her medical training gave her better judgment. When a Sherpa pointed out her tank was depleting faster than expected, she dismissed the observation. At Camp 2, Baxter purchased an additional oxygen canister from a climber leaving early due to illness. She stored all 3 bottles in her personal tent, rather than registering the extra with expedition inventory. When her tent partner, Margaret Rosen, began showing signs of altitude sickness and asked if Baxter had oxygen to spare, Baxter said she needed every bottle for her own summit attempt. The expedition leader arranged for Rosen to receive oxygen from reserve stock and descend with a Sherpa. Baxter remarked that the climber had simply not prepared adequately for the mountain. Rosen recovered at base camp over 2 days and rejoined the expedition at Camp 4 after the team's scheduled rest day, cleared by the expedition medic to continue. Before the summit push, the expedition leader conducted mandatory equipment checks at Camp 4. When he examined Baxter's 3rd bottle, he noted visible wear on one of the regulator valves and recommended she leave it behind. Baxter stated her medical background made her qualified to evaluate the equipment herself and refused to leave it, citing ownership of the bottle. The team departed at 11 p.m. Baxter carried 3 oxygen canisters strapped to her pack, approximately 8 pounds more than other climbers carried. At 27,500 feet, Rosen struggled with her breathing and fell behind, descending with a Sherpa support climber. At 28,200 feet, roughly 700 feet below the summit, Baxter began falling behind as well, stopping 3 times within a 20-minute span. The lead guide assigned a Sherpa to stay with her and continued upward with the remaining clients. At 6:40 a.m., while the Sherpa was briefly occupied assisting another climber, Baxter unclipped from the fixed rope and moved laterally across a 40-degree snow slope. A descending climber spotted her approximately 60 feet off the established route, moving slowly without clear direction, and was unable to get her attention. She continued traversing until the slope steepened to near vertical rock, then sat down in the snow, her oxygen mask hanging loose around her neck. When the descending climber reached her, 2 of her 3 bottles were empty. The 3rd, still full, had rolled 10 feet down slope and lodged against a rock. One empty regulator showed a crack at the connection valve, the same valve the expedition leader had flagged. The climber retrieved the full bottle and attempted to connect it to her mask, but Baxter did not respond to verbal prompts or physical touch. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The climber radioed the situation at 7:10 a.m. The lead guide was at the summit and could not descend immediately due to traffic on the fixed lines. The descending climber stayed with Baxter for 20 minutes, attempting to administer oxygen and warm her hands. Her breathing became irregular and shallow. At 7:35 a.m., she slumped forward. He checked for a pulse and found none. Due to his own depleting oxygen, he marked the GPS location and continued his descent. A recovery team reached Baxter's position the following morning. Her body remained in the same seated position, 60 65 feet from the fixed line. The full oxygen bottle was still lodged against the rock. The official investigation determined the cause of death as severe hypoxia, leading to high-altitude cerebral edema. The faulty valve, identified during the equipment check and ignored, caused her first bottle to deplete rapidly early in the summit push. Her self-adjusted flow rates had compounded the deficit over hours. By the time she switched to her second bottle, cognitive impairment was already advanced. The wandering from the route and inability to retrieve the full bottle beside her were consistent with late-stage edema. Baxter's body was brought down the mountain over 6 days by a specialized recovery team. It was May 11, 2013, on the ascent to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, a steep, narrow ice route with fixed ropes. Temperatures hovered around -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind and exposure made any pause risky. Every step demanded full focus. Hesitation or distraction could be deadly. Noreen Valek, 36, managed human resources for a tech company in Seattle. She was assertive, confident, and used to challenging authority in her professional life. That same mindset carried over to Everest, where she consistently questioned her guide's decisions and safety protocols. Her previous trekking experience included portions of the Annapurna Circuit and Mount Rainier, but she had never faced terrain where hesitation and debate could be fatal. I could already sense that her instinct to argue and analyze every decision wasn't going to mix well with the death zone. The route from Camp 2 to Camp 3 required precise timing and coordination. Climbers depended on the fixed rope system to keep traffic moving steadily, with designated rest points where they could pause safely. Delays in the middle of technical sections created bottlenecks, forcing other climbers into exposed positions and increasing the overall risk for the team. Noreen's habit of stopping mid-route to question instructions had already caused minor slowdowns during the expedition, but on this day, it would prove disastrous. As the team approached a particularly narrow section of steep ice, Noreen began challenging the guide's pacing instructions and route choice. Instead of moving steadily through the dangerous section, she stopped to argue, insisting her concerns be addressed immediately. Other climbers were forced to wait in exposed positions while she debated the plan. From what I can see, this was exactly the kind of split-second distraction that the mountain doesn't forgive. Her guide repeatedly told her to continue and save discussions for the designated rest point, but she refused. The delay created a bottleneck, backing up several climbers on the fixed rope. While focused on the argument, Noreen failed to pay full attention to her footing and body position. As she gestured during the discussion, her crampon caught on the rope, and she lost her balance. The fall was arrested by her climbing harness, but she swung into the ice face with considerable force. The impact caused head trauma and internal injuries. It's hard not to notice how quickly a single lapse of attention can turn a routine crossing into a fatal moment. Other climbers, still stuck in the bottleneck, were unable to provide immediate assistance. The harsh conditions, freezing temperatures, wind, and exposure made rapid help impossible. Noreen's injuries, combined with prolonged exposure, quickly overwhelmed her body's ability to maintain core functions. The guides attempted emergency stabilization, but the technical terrain prevented effective treatment or swift evacuation to a safer location. As hours passed, her condition worsened. Hypothermia set in alongside her injuries, and consciousness slipped away. Despite every effort, she could not be revived. The expedition medical officer later determined that her death resulted from blunt force trauma, complicated by severe hypothermia, with key contributing factors including the delayed response during a critical moment and failure to maintain focus while navigating technical terrain. Watching her choices pile up like this, it's clear how small decisions, stopping, debating, hesitating, stack into irreversible consequences in this environment. The incident was recorded in climbing logs as a stark example of how communication issues, hesitation, and delayed compliance can become fatal in extreme conditions. Noreen's tendency to challenge authority and assert her personal approach to climbing had ultimately cost her life. It's a tough reminder that on mountains like Everest, there's no room for ego or debate. The protocol exists for survival, and ignoring it is a gamble with zero margin for error. Her death illustrated the same harsh reality that had claimed others before her. In high-risk environments, prioritizing personal preferences over established safety measures can be deadly. Even experienced professionals used to managing and challenging situations in their work are not immune when the mountain demands immediate compliance. I can't help but feel that every step she took reflected her mindset. But on Everest, the mountain is always the final authority. It was May 11th, 2016, on the southern route of Mount Everest. The campsite consisted of dozens of tents arranged in clusters by expedition group, connected by paths stamped into the snow. Climbers moved between tents in the late afternoon, preparing gear and resting before the next rotation up the mountain. Jolene Harwood, 41, worked in real estate development and had paid for a guided expedition after completing a single mountaineering course in Colorado 6 months prior. She arrived in Nepal with climbing gear purchased online, including a harness system, carabiners, and ascending devices that cost roughly 40% less than equipment sold by the expedition outfitter. When other climbers asked about her gear during the trek to base camp, Harwood indicated she had done extensive research and found equivalent quality at better prices. During the mandatory gear inspection at base camp, the lead guide identified that Harwood's harness was a recreational sport climbing model designed for gym use and single-pitch routes. The belay loop was thinner than mountaineering standards, and the stitching was lighter weight than expedition-grade harnesses built for multi-week use under heavy loads. The guide recommended she purchase a replacement from the outfitter's supply for $280. Harwood refused, pointing to the UIAA safety certification on the label, and suggesting the guide was attempting to upsell unnecessary equipment. Over the following 2 weeks, Harwood's harness showed visible wear on the belay loop stitching. The fabric had begun to fray where it looped through the waist belt connection point. Another climber pointed this out at Camp 1, and a Sherpa raised the same concern on the climb to Camp 2. On both occasions, Harwood inspected the harness briefly and dismissed the concern, attributing it to normal abrasion and asserting she was capable of recognizing genuinely damaged equipment. She did not report the wear to the guides or request a replacement. On May 10th, the team moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet in preparation for the summit push. During the final equipment check, the expedition leader examined Harwood's harness and noted the fraying had progressed significantly, with multiple strands of the belay loop now visibly separated. He strongly recommended she use a backup harness from the emergency supply. Harwood declined, stating the harness had supported her weight throughout the expedition, and expressing unwillingness to switch to unfamiliar equipment at that stage. The summit team departed Camp 4 at 10:45 p.m. on May 10th. Harwood climbed in the middle of the group, clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope as the route zigzagged up the southeast ridge. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds averaging 15 miles per hour. At 27,900 feet, the team reached the Hillary Step, a near-vertical 40-foot rock face requiring climbers to ascend using the fixed line and jamars. At 5:50 a.m., with the sky beginning to lighten, Harwood clipped her ascender to the rope and began the climb. She moved slowly, pulling herself upward in short bursts while other climbers waited below on the narrow ridge. Halfway up, at approximately 18 feet above the slope below, she stopped to rest and leaned back, transferring her full weight onto the harness. At 6:02 a.m., the belay loop separated from the waist belt with a sharp tearing sound. The stitching had ripped completely through the connection point. Harwood dropped backward, ascender still attached to the fixed rope, but no longer connected to her body. She tumbled past the waiting climber and fell down the exposed rock and ice face below. Her body came to rest approximately 200 feet below, on a steep snow slope angled at 55 degrees. 2 guides descended from their positions and reached her location 30 minutes later. Harwood was face down in the snow, unresponsive, with no pulse or breathing. Her helmet had been knocked from her head during the fall and was located 40 feet upslope. The guides documented the scene and examined the separated harness, which remained clipped to the rope by the ascender. The belay loop had detached completely at the buckle junction, with thread bundles fully separated after weeks of repeated loading cycles. The investigation concluded that Harwood died from massive trauma sustained during the fall, including skull fractures, cervical spine damage, and severe internal injuries. The harness failure was attributed to using recreational-grade equipment for multi-week expedition climbing, a use category its UIAA certification did not cover. The visible fraying had progressed through the stitching layers until complete structural failure occurred under load. Harwood had been warned about the deteriorating equipment on 4 separate separate occasions and declined to replace it each time. Her body was recovered over 3 days before helicopter evacuation from 26,500 feet. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from equipment failure after repeated refusal to replace visibly compromised gear. On May 13, 2016, on the route between Camp 2 and Camp 3, Monica Brennan decided the Sherpas were moving too slowly and that she could find a faster path herself. Monica, a 51-year-old real estate developer from Miami, had built a career on efficiency and decisive action. She had transformed struggling properties into profitable developments through aggressive timelines and an unwillingness to accept delays. When she looked at the standard climbing route, a carefully planned path that wound through crevasse fields and across snow bridges marked by safety wands, she saw inefficiency that offended her professional instincts. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 typically required 5 to 6 hours, ascending from roughly 21,300 feet to 23,500 feet across terrain that appeared straightforward, but was riddled with hidden dangers. The Western CWM's flat appearance concealed hundreds of crevasses covered by snow bridges that could collapse without warning. The fixed rope route had been established by Sherpa teams, who had spent days probing the snow, identifying stable crossing points, and marking hazards that were invisible from the surface. Monica's assigned Sherpa was Furbu Gyaljan, 38, with 12 Everest summits, who had repeatedly tried to explain why the route followed the path it did. Monica interrupted his explanations with complaints about time being squandered on excessive caution. She had reviewed satellite imagery of the Western CWM and identified what appeared to be more direct paths between camps. Furbu explained that snow conditions shifted constantly, that what appeared solid in satellite images could be hollow underneath, and that Sherpas who deviated from established routes sometimes disappeared into crevasses and were never recovered. Monica responded that she appreciated his input, but had extensive experience making risk assessments in her professional life, and was comfortable making her own decisions about route selection. The breaking point came approximately 1 hour into the climb from Camp 2. The established route curved east around a heavily crevasse zone, adding perhaps 10 minutes to the journey. Monica could see Camp 3 in the distance, high on the Lhotse face, and could see what appeared to be a direct line across the snow. She announced she was taking the shortcut and unclipped from the fixed line before Furbu could physically intervene. Furbu shouted for her to stop, his voice sharp with alarm. Monica ignored him and began walking across unmarked snow, her crampons crunching through the surface crust. For 50 feet, the snow held. Monica glanced back at Furbu with an expression that communicated vindication, proof, in her mind, that the excessive caution was unwarranted and that decisive action was saving time. On her 51st step, the snow beneath her gave way. The crevasse had been completely hidden beneath a snow bridge, perhaps 4 feet thick, solid enough to appear safe, weak enough to fail under load. Monica dropped through without time to react, falling into darkness with a truncated scream that ended as she struck ice roughly 40 feet below the surface. The crevasse was narrow, approximately 8 feet wide at the surface, tapering to just a few feet where Monica wedged between the converging walls. The impact shattered both legs, fractured her pelvis, and caused severe internal injuries that began bleeding into her abdominal cavity. She remained conscious at first, screaming for help, her voice echoing off the ice walls and carrying weakly to the surface. Furbu moved immediately, radioing for assistance while constructing anchors at the crevasse lip. Additional Sherpas arrived over the next hour as word spread along the route, bringing rope systems and hauling equipment. The rescue required establishing bomb-proof anchors, lowering a rescuer to assess Monica's condition and secure her in a harness, then raising her using a multi-point mechanical advantage system across unstable terrain. The extraction took several hours. Monica remained conscious for much of the operation, her voice weakening as shock and hypothermia progressed. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing, and her body was pressed directly against ice. By the time she was brought to the surface near Camp 2, she had lost consciousness, her core temperature critically low. During the hauling operation, Furbu was injured while managing a loaded rope when a sudden shift in weight wrenched his arm violently, dislocating his shoulder and throwing him against an ice ridge. The injury was immediately disabling, his shoulder visibly deformed and his arm hanging uselessly at his side. Monica Brennan died later that day after being lowered to Camp 2 and prepared for evacuation, succumbing to multiple traumatic injuries compounded by hypothermia and hemorrhagic shock. The official report listed her cause of death accordingly. Furbu underwent surgical reconstruction for his shoulder and spent 8 months in rehabilitation. Although he eventually returned to work, the injury left him with permanent loss of range of motion and chronic pain that ended his career as a lead climbing Sherpa. It was April 23, 2013, at Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Climbers moved between expedition camps in the late morning, some preparing for rotations while others rested after descending. The Khumbu icefall loomed above, a chaotic maze of ice blocks and crevasses marking the route to Camp 1. Rosalind Fletcher, 43, worked as a corporate attorney and had signed up for a commercial Everest expedition after completing several weekend hiking trips in Colorado. On her application, she listed experience on 3 peaks above 14,000 feet and described herself as an experienced alpine hiker with basic technical skills suitable for guided expeditions. During the initial team meeting, the expedition leader reviewed each climber's background. When asked specific questions about crampons, ice axes, and fixed rope systems, Fletcher gave general answers suggesting familiarity without concrete examples. The leader noted her responses but did not press further, as all clients would undergo skills training during acclimatization. On the first rotation to Camp 1, Fletcher struggled with the ladder crossings over crevasses in the Khumbu icefall. She required multiple attempts to clip and unclip her safety tethers at each junction and moved significantly slower than the rest of the group. Her crampon points caught on the ladder rungs twice, causing her to freeze mid-crossing. When the guide asked about her mountaineering course, Fletcher said it had covered the basics and she just needed practice. During the second rotation to Camp 2, her technique remained poor. She frequently attached her ascender backwards or failed to properly lock the cam, requiring repeated correction from guides. Her crampon work on steep ice showed poor front-pointing form, causing excessive arm fatigue. The expedition leader recommended additional practice before the next rotation. Fletcher insisted she was improving and would be ready for the summit push, mentioning the significant money and time away from her law practice she had invested. On May 15th, the expedition moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet for the final acclimatization rotation. The route climbed the Lhotse Face, a steep ice wall requiring continuous rope work and front point technique on slopes averaging 50 to 60 degrees. Fletcher departed Camp 2 at 6 a.m. with the group. Within a few hours, she had fallen 100 feet behind, her inefficient technique requiring excessive effort with each step. By mid-morning, she had stopped twice on small ledges to rest. Her pace slowed to roughly 50 feet every 15 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., at 23,400 feet, Fletcher began coughing. The fits continued and worsened with exertion. The guide radioed the expedition leader and recommended immediate descent to Camp 2. Fletcher refused, stating she had invested too much time and money to turn back during a training rotation. She stood and continued climbing. By 2:15 p.m., her coughing had intensified dramatically, stopping her every few steps. Pink-tinged frothy sputum appeared at the corners of her mouth. The guide recognized this as high-altitude pulmonary edema and radioed an emergency. Within minutes, Fletcher was unable to stand without support, her breathing wet and gurgling. The guide clipped a short tether from his harness to hers and began lowering her down the fixed line. At 2:40 p.m., Fletcher lost consciousness. The guide continued the descent for 30 minutes, making minimal progress against her dead weight on the steep face. 2 Sherpas ascending from Camp 2 reached them at 3:10 p.m. The 3 worked together to move Fletcher down the Lhotse Face, alternating between lowering her on the rope and short roping across less steep sections. At 4:20 p.m., at 22,400 feet, 1 Sherpa checked for a pulse and found none. Her lips and face had turned bluish. They continued moving her body down to Camp 2, arriving at 6:50 p.m. exhausted. A guide with wilderness medical training confirmed she had died from pulmonary edema. The investigation reviewed Fletcher's performance records and contacted the mountaineering school listed on her application. The school confirmed she had completed only a weekend introductory course, not a comprehensive technical program. Her Colorado climbs were verified as standard hiking trails, requiring no ropes or crampons. Medical analysis concluded her poor technique forced her body to work 2 to 3 times harder than a skilled climber on the same terrain, triggering acute pulmonary edema. Her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared at 12:30 p.m. eliminated the window when descent might have reversed the condition. It was April 15th, 2015, on the slopes of Mount Everest. The morning sun stretched across the Khumbu icefall as climbers prepared to move higher, stepping carefully through shifting ice and narrow ladders. Even early in the day, the conditions felt unstable and every movement required focus. Mimosa Maktoum, 44, worked as a luxury real estate agent in Manhattan. Her climbing experience was limited to a few guided trips, but she approached Everest with strong confidence. After months of preparation and a costly expedition, she treated the climb as something she had earned rather than something she needed to adapt to. From early on, she focused heavily on documenting the journey, making it clear that reaching the summit with photos mattered to her. I noticed she treated the climb like a fixed goal, not something that could change based on conditions. As the team moved higher, guides emphasized the importance of reducing weight. At extreme altitude, even small increases in load can slow movement and increase risk. Sherpas carried carefully measured gear, balancing what was needed for survival with what they could physically manage. Every item had a purpose, and anything extra could become a problem later. Mimosa pushed back against those limits. She insisted her Sherpa carry additional personal items, including camera equipment, extra clothing, and non-essential supplies. The added weight went beyond what was recommended. When concerns were raised, she dismissed them and continued with her plan. That stood out to me. It wasn't just extra gear, it was an extra strain on someone already working at their limit. On summit push day, the team left Camp 4 in the early hours, entering the death zone where oxygen levels are critically low. At first, progress was steady, but it didn't take long for the added weight to slow things down. Her Sherpa began falling behind, breathing harder and struggling to keep pace. Other team members offered to redistribute the load, but she refused. She wanted everything kept with her, and the climb continued at a slower pace because of it. By early morning, it was clear they were behind schedule. At that altitude, timing matters. Weather windows are short, and delays increase exposure to risk. As they continued upward, winds began to pick up, and visibility started to drop. I could tell this was where things shifted. The delay wasn't just slowing them down anymore, it was putting them into worsening conditions. As they approached higher sections, the weather deteriorated quickly. Winds strengthened and temperatures dropped sharply. Other teams began turning back. Mimosa's team was still exposed, still climbing, and now dealing with fatigue and worsening weather. Her Sherpa eventually reached a point where he could not continue. The added load and altitude had taken too much out of him, and he collapsed on the route. At that moment, the expedition leader called for an immediate descent. Mimosa resisted. She argued she had come too far to turn back. The discussion took time, and in that environment, even a few minutes matter. By the time she agreed to descend, the storm had fully arrived. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the team struggled to move safely. Temperatures fell to extreme levels, and every step became harder. They were forced to stop on a narrow section of the mountain, exposed to wind and cold, with no proper shelter. This was where everything caught up at once. The delay, the added weight, and the worsening weather left them with little chance to recover. They remained exposed through the night, using up oxygen and energy while trying to stay alive. Without shelter and with limited supplies, their bodies began to shut down under the stress of altitude and cold. By morning, Mimosa could no longer continue. She had become too weak to move, and the effects of exposure had taken over. At some point during the night or early morning, she lost her footing and fell from the narrow ledge where they had stopped. Rescue teams later found her body about 200 feet below. The cause of death was ruled as severe hypothermia and exhaustion, with contributing altitude effects. The prolonged exposure, combined with earlier delays, left her body unable to recover. From how it played out, it felt preventable. The warnings about weight and timing were clear, but they were ignored in favor of personal priorities. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East-face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions. It was May 22, 2016, in the infamous death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest. Climbers moved slowly through the Hillary Step, a nearly vertical 40-foot rock face where fixed ropes guide, passage across narrow, exposed ledges. At that altitude, every minute burns precious oxygen, and a single misstep can be fatal. Yachi Timsinya, 38, a corporate lawyer from Chicago, approached the climb with the same intensity she brought to the courtroom. She had summited Denali and Aconcagua, and Everest was meant to be her ultimate achievement. I noticed from the start that she treated the mountain as a contest rather than a challenge that required careful adjustment. Her focus on personal accomplishment and being first in line drove her decisions more than judgment or experience. The Hillary Step is one of the deadliest bottlenecks on the mountain. Climbers must ascend single file, yielding to descending teams, and carefully coordinate movements. Even small delays burn precious oxygen, and every minute spent stationary increases the risk of altitude sickness. At this altitude, cognitive function deteriorates and reaction time slows. Mistakes that might be minor lower down can be fatal here. I noticed how every climber around her was operating on a razor's edge, and any disruption would ripple across the group. Timsina quickly became frustrated when she found herself behind a slower-moving team. It felt like impatience rather than concern for safety guided her actions. She demanded the team move faster, disregarding the fact that the ledges were too narrow to pass safely. Her competitive nature seemed to cloud judgment, and it became clear that she prioritized her ego over established protocols. Watching her from a distance, it felt like she was blind to the danger her own behavior was creating, as if the mountain existed only to serve her ambitions. At a critical point, halfway up the Hillary Step, she attempted to climb around the slower climbers. She detached from her safety line to reposition herself, a decision that struck me as reckless even before the fall. Every choice requires full attention and respect for the environment, and any deviation can have fatal consequences. The other climbers were visibly tense, aware that a misstep could end in disaster for anyone nearby. A sudden gust of wind struck as she transferred her weight. Without the safety line attached, she lost balance and fell backward. Her body tumbled down the rock face, striking jagged outcroppings before disappearing from view. I saw how impossible not to recognize her insistence on moving ahead. Ignoring advice and believing she could bend the mountain to her will led to this moment. Rescue teams located her body 3 days later, roughly 800 feet below the Hillary Step. The coroner ruled massive trauma as the cause of death, with contributing factors of altitude sickness and impaired judgment. Her oxygen tank was nearly full, showing that she had been adequately prepared and equipped. Her death was not a lack of resources, but a result of decisions made in defiance of experience and caution. The incident made climbing journals and forums note the dangers of ignoring protocols, and the climbers who witnessed her fall emphasized patience and teamwork as essential for survival. Timsina's law firm issued a brief statement about her adventurous spirit and declined further comment. The German climber she tried to bypass completed his summit and later started a foundation focused on mountain safety. Watching all of this unfold, I realized how dangerous ego can be. In her office, being pushy and competitive might get results, but up there, above 26,000 feet, it just made things worse. Every step needed caution, teamwork, and paying attention to the mountain. Even with gear, training, and experience, ignoring simple safety rules can quickly turn deadly. Her choices highlight the consequences of prioritizing personal ambition over collective safety. The mountain does not negotiate or bend to desire. Timsina's competitive instincts, impatience, and belief that rules could be bypassed ultimately prove fatal. It is a sobering reminder that on Everest, survival depends on discipline and situational awareness, and even the most confident individual can be undone by the environment when ego takes the lead. It was May 20th, 2014, in the death zone above Camp 4 on Mount Everest. The South Col stretched flat and windswept at 26,000 feet, a barren expanse of rock and ice wedged between Everest and Lhotse. Felicia Holt, 44, ran a yoga and wellness studio and had hired a guide service for her second attempt at Everest after turning back the previous year due to weather. She had been practicing high-altitude breathing techniques for months and mentioned frequently that her cardiovascular conditioning would compensate for her limited technical climbing experience. During training rotations, she demonstrated pranayama breathing exercises to other climbers and explained how controlled breathing could reduce oxygen consumption at altitude. On May 19th, the expedition leader briefed the team on the summit window, a narrow 18-hour period of light winds starting at midnight, followed by an incoming storm. He emphasized a strict 11 a.m. turnaround regardless of summit status. Holt questioned why their cutoff was earlier than other expeditions and whether strong climbers could push past it. The leader repeated that all clients would descend at 11 a.m. without exception. That evening, Holt learned from climbers on other teams that 2 expeditions were targeting a 1 p.m. turnaround. She approached her guide to question why their timeline was more conservative. The guide explained that their group's oxygen supplies and client experience levels required the earlier schedule. Later, another team member mentioned that Holt had been asking whether the guides would actually enforce the turnaround if climbers were close to the summit. During the final equipment check at Camp 4, Holt asked whether 1 oxygen bottle would be sufficient if she used her breathing techniques to reduce consumption. The leader confirmed that 2 bottles were mandatory and not negotiable. Holt packed both, but told another climber she expected to use only 1. At 11:30 p.m., the team began the summit push. They reached the balcony at 4:20 a.m. and rested briefly. When supplemental oxygen use began, Holt activated 1 bottle at a reduced flow rate, intending to extend its duration. She left her second bottle cached at the balcony, telling her Sherpa she would retrieve it on the descent if needed. At 9:40 a.m., the team reached 28,700 feet on the final ridge approach. A line of approximately 30 climbers from multiple expeditions had formed on the fixed rope ahead, advancing roughly 50 feet every 10 minutes. The guide calculated their arrival time and determined the group could not reach the summit before 11 a.m. He instructed the group to descend. Holt unclipped from the fixed line and remained stationary. The guide repeated the instruction and gestured toward the descent route. When he touched her shoulder and pointed downward, she turned away and began moving upward along the edge of the fixed line, stepping around clipped-in climbers waiting their turn and disrupting the established order on the rope. The guide followed briefly, then stopped to radio for assistance and remained with the 3 other clients who agreed to descend. By 11:15 a.m., Holt had gained 80 feet and merged into traffic from 2 other expeditions. Her reduced flow rate had extended her bottle further than standard use, but by 10:45 a.m., it was empty. She continued upward using her breathing techniques, her pace slowing considerably. At 12:10 p.m., Holt reached the summit. She had climbed the final 130 feet without supplemental oxygen and stood at the top for approximately 3 minutes before beginning her descent. The traffic on the ridge had worsened in both directions. By 1:30 p.m., she was at 28,600 feet, moving slowly and no longer clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope correctly. At 2:05 p.m., she sat down on the narrow ridge. Her oxygen mask hung loosely over her face, connected to the empty bottle. She fumbled with her pack straps but could not manage the clips and did not respond to climbers passing, who asked if she needed help. At 2:20 p.m., she slumped sideways, her body held in place only by the Jumar still attached to the fixed line. 3 nearby climbers attempted to share oxygen using a spare regulator. Her breathing was already shallow and irregular. It stopped at 2:45 p.m. The incoming storm arrived that evening, and high winds the following day prevented any recovery above the south summit. Holt remained fixed to the rope at 28,600 feet, her second oxygen bottle still sitting at the balcony over 1,100 feet below. The investigation determined she died from acute hypoxia, compounded by exhaustion, concluding that caching her backup supply and refusing the turnaround had left her no margin for the traffic delays on the ridge. The report noted that controlled breathing techniques provide no meaningful protection against hypoxia in the death zone. She was not recovered until 6 weeks later. It was August 3, 2016, on the technical north face of Mount Everest's western alpine region. The route was typically climbed over multiple days using established protection systems. But that morning, a climber attempted an untested direct variation that had never been completed before. Miranda Deza was 29, a software engineer from a mountain city in the western United States with 8 years of rock and alpine climbing experience. She had completed multiple Grade 4 routes in regional mountain ranges and was regarded as technically skilled on exposed vertical terrain. Friends described her as precise with anchor placement and efficient in lead climbing, but increasingly interested in speed ascents and unconventional variations that reduce dependence on established routes. Her objective was to establish a new direct line up Everest's north face sector by bypassing the traditional traverse section designed to avoid fractured rock zones. The proposed path crossed a band of granite that expedition reconnaissance notes had previously described as highly unstable due to block fragmentation. Several experienced climbers had inspected the variation line in earlier seasons and declined to attempt it because of unreliable protection opportunities. The North Face corridor rises through steep mixed rock and ice terrain. The orientation of the wall limits early sunlight exposure, allowing overnight freeze conditions to persist on surface holds. In the week prior to the climb, repeated freeze-thaw cycles had increased rockfall reports along north-facing sections of the mountain. Local mountain safety authorities issued advisories warning about loose block movement in that zone. Deesa's usual climbing partner declined to attempt the direct variation due to instability concerns. She chose to climb alone. At approximately early morning, she was observed leaving the base camp zone carrying minimal gear, a light rack of protection devices, a single rope system, and equipment suitable for a planned single-day ascent. By mid-morning, she had bypassed the first established belay station, confirming commitment to the untested line. Climbers on a neighboring route later reported seeing her moving cautiously but steadily through the lower pitches. Several hours into the ascent, she reached a zone roughly midway up the face where solid granite transitioned into stacked, fractured rock blocks. The route required traversing left across a loose rock band to reconnect with a more stable vertical crack system. Observers using binoculars from lower valley observation points noted that she spent extended time testing each potential handhold before committing weight. Movement appeared deliberate, with repeated repositioning to confirm stability. Around late morning, while transferring body weight onto a large rock block during the traverse, the structure suddenly detached from the wall. The block, later estimated to be roughly refrigerator-sized, broke free without warning. Its movement triggered additional rock displacement above the climbing line, producing a cascading debris fall across a wide section of the face. Deisa fell approximately several dozen feet before her rope system caught on a natural granite protrusion below. The catch prevented a longer uncontrolled fall, but left her suspended directly below the unstable zone. During the rockfall cascade, multiple fragments struck her helmet and upper body. Investigators later determined that at least one large rock impact struck her head region, while additional debris impacted her torso and shoulders. Climbers below immediately contacted emergency services. However, continuing rockfall activity delayed helicopter response because rotor airflow could have destabilized loose rock above the site. A technical ground rescue team began ascending through the same unstable terrain. Rescuers reached the location several hours later, but she was unresponsive and was pronounced dead during the rescue operation, despite stabilization attempts. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be severe traumatic brain and internal injuries from multiple rock impacts, with helmet damage consistent with high-force collision. Following the incident, mountain safety advisories were updated to warn against direct variation attempts on Everest's north face. Expedition guides emphasize that freeze-thaw rock instability creates objective hazards that cannot be overcome by technical skill alone. Personal records recovered from her gear indicated she was aware of the loose rock zone, but chose to continue the attempt. It was May 3, 2017, on the standard southeast ridge route of Mount Everest. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,000 feet, a collection of tents anchored to ice ledges carved into the 50-degree slope. Claudia Beverly, 49, was part of a commercial expedition and had paid for a premium package that included dedicated Sherpa support and customized services. She worked in wealth management and had completed one previous high-altitude climb on Mount Kilimanjaro, which required no technical skills or supplemental oxygen. Beverly mentioned frequently that her premium fee entitled her to personalized attention and scheduling flexibility that standard packages did not include. During the 3-week acclimatization period, Beverly requested modifications to the climbing schedule, including later departure times and extended breakfast periods with specific meal preparations requiring separate cooking. When the expedition leader explained that everyone ate the same meals at the same time for efficiency, Beverly pointed to her package's mention of customized service. The guides accommodated her requests when possible, though this required her personal Sherpa to prepare food separately. Beverly also requested longer rest stops during climbs. During the ascent from Camp 1 to Camp 2, She stopped 6 times, each time resting for 10 to 15 minutes, causing the group to arrive at Camp 2, nearly 2 hours behind the main team. When the expedition leader noted that extended delays could create problems during the summit push, Beverly maintained she was managing her energy appropriately and understood her own physical limits. On May 2nd, the expedition leader announced a weather window opening May 4th, with summit attempts departing Camp 4 around midnight. He emphasized that all climbers needed to maintain group pace for safe descent before afternoon weather deterioration. Beverly approached him privately to argue that her premium package entitled her to climb at her own pace with dedicated Sherpa support. The leader explained that no exceptions were possible above Camp 4. Beverly did not raise the issue again, but remained visibly dissatisfied. On May 3rd, the team arrived at the South Col at 2:30 p.m. with plans to depart at 11 p.m. During the rest period, Beverly made multiple requests to her Sherpa for hand warmers, specific snacks, and adjustments to her oxygen setup, each requiring equipment to be unpacked and repacked. When the guide called for departure at 10:45 p.m., Beverly emerged 15 minutes late. The team left at 11:10 p.m., already behind schedule. Beverly climbed slowly from the start, stopping frequently. The team reached the balcony at 5:20 a.m., 50 minutes behind the planned schedule. After a brief rest, the group resumed at 5:25 a.m. Beverly stood 4 minutes later and followed. At 8:50 a.m., the team reached 28,400 feet, with the summit 600 feet above. The guide radioed base camp, and the decision was made to continue with a firm 11:30 a.m. turnaround. At 9:15 a.m., Beverly sat down on the fixed line, despite instructions to maintain pace. The guide helped her to her feet after 3 minutes. The team reached the summit at 10:45 a.m. Beverly spent 8 minutes at the top, while her Sherpa photographed her. Other team members had already begun descending after 2 to 3 minutes. She started down at 10:55 a.m. Her pace slowed immediately. The 300-foot stretch between the summit and South Summit took 75 minutes, with Beverly stopping 6 times on the fixed line. By 1:40 p.m., the team was at 27,800 feet, with winds at 30 miles per hour and temperature falling to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Beverly sat down and could not continue under her own power. The guide instructed the Sherpas to short rope her, keeping a shortened length of rope between Beverly and a Sherpa to physically control her movement down the slope. At 3:50 p.m., at 27,200 feet, Beverly collapsed and could not stand even with assistance. 2 Sherpas managed to move her approximately 50 feet over 20 minutes before progress became impossible. With darkness less than 90 minutes away and the team still 1,200 feet above camp, the guide established an emergency bivouac at a small rock outcrop at 27,150 feet. At 5:10 p.m., Beverly became unresponsive. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour, and temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing stopped at 5:45 p.m. The guide and Sherpas descended through darkness using headlamps, reaching Camp 4 at 8:20 p.m., with frostbite injuries to their extremities. Beverly's body was recovered on May 8th when conditions improved. The investigation determined death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, concluding that her cumulative delays, totaling roughly 2.5 hours beyond a standard ascent, placed the team in an unrecoverable position as daylight and oxygen supplies ran out simultaneously. The report noted that the Sherpas and guide who remained with Beverly sustained serious frostbite injuries as a direct consequence of the extended time spent above 27,000 feet attempting to assist her descent. It was September 14th, 2018, during the post-monsoon climbing season on Mount Everest. The mountain was experiencing unusually dry conditions, creating deceptive weather that masked the serious hydration challenges facing climbers in the death zone. Guadi Escolastico, 46, a wellness entrepreneur from Beverly Hills, had built her brand around biohacking and optimizing human performance through unconventional methods. She promoted intermittent fasting, specialized hydration protocols, and metabolic efficiency training. Her Everest expedition was meant to prove her theories, documented for a planned Netflix series on extreme wellness. At extreme altitude, the human body loses water rapidly through heavy breathing and dry air. Climbers typically need 4 to 6 liters of fluid daily, along with 5,000 to 6,000 calories, just to keep their bodies functioning. Dehydration above 26,000 feet thickens the blood, reduces oxygen transport, and impairs cognition, compounding the dangers of altitude. Medical teams at base camp had stressed strict hydration and nutrition, warm liquids every 30 minutes, high-calorie foods every hour, and avoiding low-altitude strategies were essential. Escolastico dismissed these warnings, believing her own mountain optimization protocol could handle the stress. She practiced strategic dehydration to train her kidneys and intermittent fasting to improve fat-burning efficiency, ignoring her guide's advice. It was wild to think someone could be so confident in their methods that they ignored experts. I kept imagining how tempting it would be to feel smarter than everyone else, even when your life is on the line. From Camp 4, she immediately deviated from standard hydration practices. She drank little, claiming her body was adapted for efficiency. Warm tea and soup were declined because they didn't fit her self-imposed precision nutrition schedule. By morning near 27,000 feet, warning signs were clear. Her speech slurred, coordination faltered, and urine output dropped to almost nothing. She was showing early dehydration despite the cold. Seeing someone ignore these signs made it clear how easy it is to misread your own body. I pictured myself stumbling, thinking everything was fine, not realizing the danger. Her guide pressed her to drink, but she insisted her body was accessing stored hydration, and that stopping her protocol would hurt performance. As they climbed, her blood thickened, reducing oxygen flow to her brain and muscles. She stumbled frequently and showed confusion, but remained determined to follow her plan. By 28,000 feet, dehydration-induced altitude sickness became severe. Her heart raced, skin lost elasticity, and she experienced disorientation. She finally drank, but her body could not process fluids at that altitude, and the damage was irreversible. I couldn't help but feel scared seeing how stubborn decisions could pile up, one after another, pushing someone past the point of no return. During the final push to the summit, her severely dehydrated body gave out. She collapsed, unable to stay upright on the icy slope. Her guide quickly secured her with a safety rope and began emergency rehydration, giving small sips of electrolyte solution while monitoring her pulse and breathing. He radioed base camp for urgent evacuation, explaining her critical condition. Despite these efforts, her body continued to weaken. Her movements were sluggish, her skin pale and dry, and she became increasingly disoriented. The extreme altitude amplified the effects of dehydration, making the descent a struggle for both her and the guide. Even with help from team members, the prolonged lack of fluids had caused irreversible damage. She died at 28,400 feet from severe dehydration, acute mountain sickness, and cardiovascular failure. The coroner found her blood dangerously concentrated, essentially turning her circulatory system into sludge. Her water bottles were nearly full, proving she had deliberately avoided proper hydration. The incident was widely reported in wellness publications as a cautionary tale about applying unproven theories in extreme environments. Reading her story, it struck me how easy it is to trust ideas that feel good but aren't safe. I pictured myself in her shoes, seeing confidence turn into danger when basic survival rules are ignored. Her final social media post, published after her death, promoted listening to your body's wisdom, advice that could have saved her. Escolastico's story shows that at extreme altitude, proper hydration, oxygen, and nutrition are critical, and ignoring them can be fatal. It was April 22, 2014, in the lower Khumbu icefall on Mount Everest, around 19,500 feet. This section is one of the most dangerous on the route, with shifting ice towers, hidden crevasses, and thin snow bridges. Temperatures range from -5 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but wind and exposure made it feel much colder. Every step required careful footing, balance, and reliable gear. Lenora Svek, 39, worked as a fashion buyer in New York City and approached the climb like she did her career, focused on style and appearance. Her experience was limited to guided climbs of Mount Washington and Mount Whitney, where mistakes were minor inconveniences. On Everest, she prioritized how gear looked and felt over its functionality. I could already see this was going to be a problem. The mountain doesn't care about style, only what works. The icefall demanded specialized equipment, insulated gloves, heavy base layers, and full-body protection against sudden cold and exposure. Lenora had opted for lighter alternatives, arguing that bulk would slow her down. Her gloves were designed for moderate cold, not the the sustained freezing conditions of the icefall. That morning, guides ran their routine equipment check and again recommended she switch to heavier gear. She refused. I get wanting to move faster or feel more comfortable, but in this environment, comfort isn't really the goal, survival is. Within the first hour, the consequences of her choices became apparent. She stopped frequently to adjust her layers and warm her hands, which were already showing signs of reduced circulation. Each pause slowed the team and increased exposure to unstable ice. Small issues start to stack up fast in places